The Minister of Education, Jan Tinetti, yesterday said that they are now going to legislate, although not until 2026, they're now going to legislate that there be a common curriculum taught in our schools for reading, writing and arithmetic. And when I discussed that with just about everybody that I've talked in the last 24 hours, they went, and this is ordinary people on the street, don't we already have one? To discuss this and the reaction of his party to the events of yesterday and what they will do, should they be part of a government, and after last night's poll it would seem pretty evident that they are, is ACT's education spokesperson Chris Baillie, and he joins us now. Chris, thanks very much for joining us now. How's caucus going?
Yeah, no, all over. We finished a bit early today, Michael.
Well, you're probably a bit chipper, are you?
Yeah, no, things are tracking in the right direction, but certainly there's a long time to go yet.
Accepted, but I mean, if I had a poll like that 8 weeks out from the election that I saw last night, I would be feeling quietly confident. Are you feeling quietly confident?
I'll give you that. Quietly confident could be it, but like I say, this is, I've only been in this game a short time, but a week is a long time in politics, is the phrase.
Yes, they say that, but polls don't work that way. I've been in polling and politics for a long time too, Chris, and I've got to be honest with you, when you get the preponderance of polls that you've got all telling you the same story 2 months out from the election, I'm not aware of any political election of the last 50 years in any Western democracy that reverses those kinds of trends.
Well, that's good to hear, and I'll take you up on that.
All right, okay, moving on. Yesterday, as I said, Jan Tinetti, the Minister of Education, did something that most parents thought was already happening, and that was this understanding that when we send our kids off to school, they're going to be taught a curriculum, that it's taught in all of the schools, and it's taught roughly the same way. And yesterday, we all got a bit of a shock that it wasn't, and the government's going to do something about it. What was the reaction of yourself and the ACT Party to that?
Yeah, look, it just seems really strange that over the last 6 years, that this government has really dismantled what was known as a curriculum and put their own agenda in it. And suddenly, a couple of months before an election, they decide that it's probably prudent to get back to basics, like we've said for a long time.
Sorry, to explain to listeners, there's something called the common practice model, which is what it is. It's a common practice model. It's currently being developed by an expert group. It's expected to be released for consultation later on this year, and it will be implemented in legislation next term of government, should National or Labor get in. Will you be legislating as well, or do you need to?
Look, it's not something we have discussed in caucus, but it's something that I would be hesitant to legislate with. We really need to start trusting our schools, trusting our principals and our teachers, and with basic guidelines of what's needed to learn, how to actually do that is really best up to our teachers who know best.
Well, I might have to disagree with you on that. I don't know. If I left it to a whole series of teachers and schools out there, you might not get the curriculum taught at all. Surely, Chris, that's the problem.
Yeah, well, that's one option. I mean, that's another issue really is teacher training and whether the consistency is there across teacher training. However, I think once schools know what should be learnt, what's meant to be learnt, and really it should be able to be implemented with some guidelines, of course. Well,
but it isn't just about teaching maths, reading and writing the same way. It's also about, A, there's a common curriculum, B, that is taught the same way. I think Jan Tinetti gave the example yesterday of some kid from Northland who goes to Christchurch. And they're taught in a primary school something, and they've moved to Christchurch because, kids move around. Of course they do. All families do in New Zealand. And they go and it's like they've moved to a different country because they're taught in a completely different way, exactly the same curriculum, but the kind or style of teaching is different. And so they're basically back to square one. Do you accept that is the system at the moment?
Possibly, yeah. We should have best practices, absolutely. But it's great that Jan Tenetti's just realising this now.
The National Party education spokesperson Erica Stanford, she released, she's been very all over this one like a rash actually. They released their policy, I think about 2 months ago. Does ACT have any difficulty with the declared intentions of National when it comes to its education policy?
No, look, we're very much a get back to basics and stop this social agenda ideology that has crept in education over the last few years. It's one of the reasons I'm in politics. I was a teacher three and a half years ago, and it was really I could see the amount of extra stuff and irrelevant stuff that teachers were having to do. It was just ridiculous.
Chris, were you a secondary or primary teacher?
I was a secondary teacher.
Okay. What subjects do you teach, just quietly?
I trained as a music and English teacher, but for the last 10 years I was the special needs coordinator or head of a learning special needs department. That's
fascinating, because I haven't told you about this, but this morning there's been I think it's from the Dunedin longitudinal study. You know, you'll be aware of the one that's been going for, be almost 40 or 50 years now. And there is a correlation between kids with learning disabilities, which shouldn't surprise anybody, I guess, psychological problems, and failure at NCA level. And the argument is that not enough has been done by successive governments to deal with children who are coming in with special needs into our schools, to give them the opportunity to achieve later on in their schooling career. Do you accept that criticism?
Yeah, look. If we want to talk about consistency, the consistency with the way we deal with our special needs kids is just not there throughout New Zealand. I know some fantastic schools. One I taught at was great, but a lot of emphasis and a lot of care and effort around those kids. But I know others that just don't have the resources or the expertise to do it. So yeah, it's certainly an issue.
Well, that's mainstreaming, isn't it? It goes back to the late 1980s where we decided we were going to mainstream all our special needs kids. And so they went into 2,500 schools all over New Zealand. And the teachers just went, oh my God. They end up with people like my son, for example. Now, my son has got diagnosed ADD, ADHD, and he's in a class. And I imagine he spends a great deal of time testing his teachers' patience, and they spend a lot of time just dealing with his behaviour issues when they're not teaching the rest of the class. What are we going to do about that? Because the kids like my son are becoming more prominent in the teaching or in the secondary and primary system, not less.
Yeah, no, it's a huge issue. I mean, the department I taught at, the aim was to mainstream. The aim was to get the kids out into the mainstream, but those kids need to be ready to go, ready to be able to sit in a classroom and do the work that's limited, maybe, but that is being set. And with teacher aides are an invaluable resource, and we always hear of how short schools are of teacher aid. The inconsistency with funding with all of that stuff has been quite marked throughout, as you say, the last few decades.
Well, and just let's talk teacher aides for a second. I mean, you've got to have a severely, either mentally or physically handicapped child to get a teacher aide. I mean, they're as scarce as teeth. You've got to be severely disabled. There are a lot of children that fall in between the crack of being normal and teacher aid need, aren't there?
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. There are different ways of getting funding which schools can acquire teacher aides, and again, it's very inconsistent. It depends who can write the best report. Often kids, we know there are issues with kids, but without a formal diagnosis, then forget about getting any sort of funding. So it really, that side of education really needs to be sorted.
Well, you used to have something called, was it the Special Education Service? I think it was they were sort of the psychological people that used to be going around. and they would go into schools and they'd say, okay, that kid needs to be assessed and we'll assess them. Does that still exist in your experience?
No, not to my knowledge. I'm sure kids get assessed, but for what they call ALS funding, which is ongoing resource funding, they need a clinical diagnosis to have any shot at getting any sort of funding. And the increase in students arriving at schools with all sorts of other issues, anxiety issues and depression issues, that really we never had that much of. It has always been around, but not that much of, but quite prevalent in most schools these days.
Well, and I'm glad you've commented on that, because that's the other thing that this longitudinal study notes in some ways, is that you've got, and it was a different study actually now I think about it, an increasing number of kids with, as you say, anxiety disorders, depression, ADD, ADHD, other series of behavioural and learning difficulties heading to our schools. Why? I mean, has anybody actually sat back and said, well, it wasn't like that in 1950 and it wasn't like that in 1990. Why is it like this in 2023? You've been somebody at the coalface. Have you got some sort of idea as to why there's been this massive upturn in these kind of children?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons, and it's probably not enough time at the moment. But I've got a few kids, and they got sick of me saying, telling them to be more resilient and building them up. So there's a lack of, there's lots of things missing in kids growing up. The being able to fail, all of those sorts of things that I think have contributed, but also the ongoing pressures of family relationships and family incomes, all of those sorts of things I'm sure combine to make kids find things pretty difficult to get by.
It's just that, I mean, I'm pretty sure that my parents' generation are a lot poorer than this one in real terms. But they didn't turn out so many kids that were loopy. Just quietly. Genetically, I sometimes think that maybe as we're getting older, older eggs, older sperm and stuff like that, that might account for things like ADD, ADHD, particularly if there's that in the family, as people, particularly white people, have their children later. But you're also suggesting there are parenting issues there, the way in which you raise your children, as well as the environment in which you raise them.
Absolutely, parenting and schooling, of course, and just the way society has changed over the years. I think has made students less resilient to the pressures that they're going to face in the real world.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Now, just finally on Jan Tinetti, if you do get elected on the 14th of October, and let's just suggest that last night's poll translates into reality in 8 weeks' time. Do you expect, you personally expect Erica Stanford to be the Minister of Education?
I am sure that's what Christopher Luxon has in mind, yeah.
Well, I mean, you'll have a say, I assume, in how many portfolios and which portfolios you get, though, in the ACT Party? I will have nothing to do with those negotiations, but I'm sure there'll be a lot of talk. I'm not, without giving anything away, have you discussed what the post-election environment will look like, or is that something that is out of your pay grade?
Yeah, no, seriously, I haven't discussed that at all. I'm spokesperson for police as well. I was a police officer for a few years, so I've got that. I'm a spokesperson for police, and also I've got a small business, so I've a small business spokesperson. So there are other sorts of negotiations that I'm sure will happen.
And finally, where did you end up on the list?
I'm number 17. So I dropped down a few, but I'm quite happy.
All right, so you've got to get about what you're polling at the moment to get in, do you?
Yes, if last night was the election, I'd be in.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for joining us, Chris. I appreciate your time. That is Chris Baillie, the Act and Education Police spokesperson. Oh, I didn't realise it was number 17.